welcome to Container Usage Patterns. The objective of this session is to sort of reveal tips and tricks, tools that you might want to consider when using containers, part of the ecosystem, and things you should be doing as part of your usage of containers, particularly using the Docker runtime, right? Talks like this, from a experience perspective, tend to be always a little bit choppy. It's very hard to build a very smooth narrative. I'll try and do my best, but we'll see how it plays out. Very quickly, my name is Raju. I'm based out of Columbus, Ohio. I'm an independent consultant. I spend a lot of time consulting around the DevOps space, and I do spend a lot of time design and architecture because not everything scales the way you want it to scale. It's not DevOps enabled. I'm at Loosely Typed on Twitter. I'm a regular speaker here at Devnexus. I've been nice enough to be invited, so that's kind of cool. Just a shameless plug since I have your attention. I just wrote this book. Anyone read the Head First series in this book? Head First Design Patterns. So this just came out in January of this year. Some of you might be familiar with Git, but if you're not, and then check out that handsome fella on the cover. Yeah? I wrote on the book on JavaScript, which no one cares about in this talk, so let's move on. Let's start at the top. How many of you have used volumes with containers? How many of you have used named volumes with containers? Usually the number of hands that shows up the first time around as opposed to the second time is about a third. If you're not familiar, Docker now supports volume, so you actually have a subcommand called Docker volume. You can list all the volumes that are, and I'll show you pictures because I like pictures, but what you can do is you can create a volume, Docker volume create myvol, call it whatever you want. So what you've effectively created is a logical space for containers to write to. Now what I can do is I can say Docker run interactive teletype, mount that volume just like you mount a regular volume, except in this case I'm going to give it the name. Let's just mount it to /temp. I'm going to run an Alpine 3.12 container and start a shell in it, split the window, start another one that's mounted on the same volume, and now if I go to /temp, I do an ls, there's nothing. If I touch devnexus.txt, I go to the other container and I do cd/temp, temp would be nice, and I do an ls, you see devnexus.txt. If I echo, you all are awesome, into devnexus, and in the other container I do a cat of devnexus, you get that. So what you get essentially using named volumes is almost like host mounting the file system of your host into a container. However, the benefits of it are, well, if you like pictures, what you're doing essentially is creating a sort of space in the Docker managed space on your host, and then two containers can actually communicate over the file system if they need to. What you get out of this is that you get host agnosticism. If you are mounting your host file system, let's say I'm on Windows, you are on Linux, what am I going to mount? I'm going to mount C:, is Windows / or /? How many of you don't remember? Do you see the problem? Yeah. So the problem is if you mount a file system using a host file system, what you tend to do is put paths that are not host agnostic. Whereas with this, all you're doing is creating a sort of USB drive that's managed by Docker. The benefits, what I mean by persistent, is that how many of you know the Docker system prune command? How many of you have used that? How many of you have used it in anger? Right? Oh my God, CI servers, disk pressures filling up. I gotta do something. Docker system prune, here's the cool bit. Notice what you don't see in that list. volumes. So volumes are truly persistent. To be able to remove a volume, you literally have to say a Docker volume, name of volume, RM, and then you get rid of it. So even if the container disappears, what you manage is the volume. Now, why would you ever use something like this? Why would you ever think about using a pattern like this? Splunk forwarder, any kind of indexer. Now, there are caveats here. Don't write log files from 2 or more services to the same container on the same path, because then you step on each other's toes, but the point still stands. How many of you have used named networks in Docker? Are you just being shy, or you've never used them? Named networks are yet another sum command, so I'm just going to know out of this. Just like you can do a Docker volume command, you can do a Docker network command. And here I can say Docker network create, and please, somebody get this reference. I was teaching a class just 3 or 4 weeks ago. I did Skynet. 2/3 of the class had no idea what I was talking about. So, anywho, what was that? So I create a network called Skynet. You can configure this. This can be a host. This can be a bridge network. It doesn't matter. And then what I can do is I can have containers join that. So we will do a Docker run interactive teletype, give it the name of the network to join. So we'll say network Skynet. And then we will start, we will give it a name in this case. So let's just call it Devnexus. And I will start an Alpine container, 3.12, give me a shell prompt. So now I'm in the container. In the other, I'll start something similar. Let me just hit an enter. All right, so we will start another container joining, please note, same network. So they both are sitting on the same network. Let's name it Atlanta, right? Here's the cool bit. You can discover the other container over DNS. Wow, you're a tough crowd to please. Yeesh. At this point, all the folks who have any operational background are thinking, oh my God, thank God, you're not discovering IP addresses and doing shenanigans with /etc/resolve.conf. All of that goes away. 2 containers sharing the same network can actually discover each other. If you have ever written a connection string to a database, yeah, what do you normally do? Hostname, port number. If the database is running in the container, if your service is running in a container, just make them join the same network, and voila, all you have to do is container name, port number, and boom, you have a connection string, which is pretty cool. Most people tend to loop back over the host network stack. Right, they do a host 127 or so and then loop back into the container. No need to do that anymore. You have automatic DNS resolution within the Docker network. Pretty cool, right? Here's another bit. If I exit out of this and I start another container that is not part of the network, can't start 2 ATLs. Let's just get rid of that. I'll just start another container. And if I try and ping Devnexus, no cigar. So this is what we just created. We created in this case, I created a bridge network. You can be a host network. It can be any one of the 4 kinds of Docker networks that they support. I have 2 containers talking to each other over the network. DNS resolution happens automatically, as opposed to a 3rd container that's not sitting on that network, just doesn't see it. Now, that's not to say you're getting network level isolation, right? This is not the same thing, but it does make discovery easier. If you've anyone used Docker Compose in this room? Compose uses the exact same trickery. Kubernetes uses the same sort of trickery inside a pod. Same magic is going on. So you get automatic DNS resolution. You don't have to publish anymore. Oh my God, that hack. Oof. And then no linking necessary, which was essentially just rewriting etc/resolve. And don't have to do that anymore. How many of you have used a tool called Dive? One hand. How many of you care about, okay, a couple of hands. How many of you have ever, don't be shy, I wasn't picking on you. That's Shantanu, right? You Shantanu? I know Shantanu, he was in my workshop yesterday. Dive is a fantastic tool if you ever are struggling with image sizes. Everyone understands the union file system that containers are made out of, right? You have layers, each layer adds some certain of files. You can never delete files in the parent layer because everything is immutable, yada, yada, yada. How do you figure out what happened in a particular layer? What I did here, and I started it up before the session started because it takes a while for it to sort of introspect. I'll show you how to start it up in a second, but I have Dive running here. This is a TUI, a terminal user interface. What you are seeing on the left-hand side are all the layers that my image is made up of. Yeah, so that's the union file system with the latest one being at the bottom. On the right-hand side, what you are seeing is a list of files as seen by that file system, right? So the last layer will obviously be a union of everything above it. But what you can do is you can tab over and notice the pink at the bottom of the screen. You can filter files based on whether they were added, removed, modified, what have you. So let's just remove all the other filters. So you'll say Control R, Control M, Control U, Control B. So we can just see all the files that were added in that layer. If I tab back to the other side and I move one up, this layer added all of these files. For some reason, you might notice I very intelligently added my .vs code files in the container, which should tell you that's a problem. Why would you ever do that in a container? You can see even stuff like that. But the best part about this is on the left-hand side, you also tend to see the sizes. And this is super important, especially if you notice that a container, especially on build and then built again and built again, tends to take longer and longer. Why is that? Because there's a good chance that you are introducing something in a lower layer that you could get away by putting in an upper layer, right? So move things up so those layers don't keep getting rebuilt. Does that make sense to everyone? How's everyone doing with that? It takes a little bit of experience to use it, but I highly encourage. If you are having image issues, which if you're not concerned, you should be, brilliant tool to be able to interrogate any kind of file or UFS or union file system. How's everyone doing? Questions? Yes, sir. This is a command line tool. So let me just exit out of this. So the command line tool, and I'm glad you brought that up because you just gave me a segue for a future session or a future topic today. Here's the command. So what you do is you can actually run it in a container. So the image you are running is actually that one. It's wa_goodman/dive. I'm running the latest one. And you just give it the name of the image you wish to interrogate. And since you did bring this up, I want you to all pay attention to this piece because I'm going to talk about that in a second. That is another brilliant trickery that we're going to talk about. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, what was that? Yes, so the gentleman brings up a good point that Dive is actually available as an executable if you wanted it. But I prefer, once you taste containers, you've tasted blood, you're not going back, right? If you can run it in containers, you're going to run it in containers. But yes, thank you for that suggestion. Yes, absolutely, you can run it as an executable. If you're running things on CI, which if you're building on CI, you have the Docker runtime available, so there's no reason not to ever run it in a container. Everybody good? Any other questions? All right. How many of you lint your Docker files? Hadolint is a very nice tool that can, by the way, if anyone wants the slides, feel free to touch base with me. All of the underlined words are links. I just make it easy for you if you get the PDF. But Hadolint is a brilliant tool. Again, available as an executable, thanks to the suggestion the gentleman made. But what I like to do is I can run Hadolint as a container. What I've done here is, if you look right there, not to pick on an open source project, things have gotten better since I downloaded this Docker file. Everyone know what Jenkins is, or at least has a baseline assumption. This is a open source CI system for popular in the Java world. They have a Docker image, so I just downloaded their Docker file just for experimentation purposes. And what I'm going to do is I am going to run Hadolint against it. So all I'm doing is piping Hadolint. I'm going to clear the screen, so I apologize for that. And what Hadolint does is it tells you things that you can fix in your Docker file. So it's basically doing some kind of analysis. What it's telling you here is that you have done an apt get install of something without specifying a particular version. In other words, please pin down your version numbers. It's telling you to not do a copy without setting work directories, blah, blah, blah. So it's a great tool just to run it as you are developing Docker files. It prevents silly mistakes from happening. You avoid creating large images, potentially. And the nice thing is that it gives you these codes. Now, just a heads up, we are all in Atlanta. This is the headquarters of Delta. Yes? So please don't Google DL3008. You will most likely get the schedule for some flight. Oh, look at that. It actually worked. But you usually get one of these, which is some flight from Albuquerque to Hawaii or something like that, which is not helpful. However, I managed to get it the first time around. What they've done is I hate these pages. On GitHub, they give you not just the code, they tell you what to do and how to solve it. So it's a wiki with codes attached to it. So it's kind of nice if you're confused about what the error message is, you can fix it pretty quickly. Everyone okay? Questions?
Is there an extension for that? IE or something?
That's a good question, and honestly, I don't know. I've used this for so long on the command line that
I mean, that's perfect for a pipeline or something like that.
yeah. So there is a brew install, thanks to the gentleman in the back again. But there's a CLI, there's configure, blah, 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 blah. And integrations. Oh, look at that. There's Atom, Sublime Text, NeoVim, Emacs, Visual Studio Code, whatever that is. Okay. And you can obviously hook into it with version control, right? So thank you for that question. Yes, sir. No, it does not. So it's not, you're trying to find a way to fail the build if that, no. But it does return you appropriate status code. So you can then check against the status code and, yeah. Yep, so it does return status codes that you can introspect in scripts. Yes, sir. This is only for Dockerfiles, correct. Are there other tools for Docker Compose? I don't know if there's a Docker Compose lint. Because mostly there you're sort of, hopefully you're mostly just stitching together other Docker files. Again, I don't know if there is. I don't want to mislead you, but I don't know. Hopefully mostly you're doing is stitching together things as opposed to building things in Docker Compose, so you won't run into some of these issues. So like I said, please be sure you don't Google for DL3015 unless you're flying somewhere. That's helpful. How many of you heard of Trivi? One hand. There is a SNCC, which is outside. They have a booth. So if you've ever done a Docker build, you might have seen at the bottom, use SNCC to detect vulnerabilities. This is an open source tool called Trivi. And what Trivi does is, again, you can run it in a container. You can actually download the executable. And if you run it against some image, it tells you the CVEs that are associated in that image. This one is a highly configurable tool. You can tell it, hey, I only want critical and high. I only want CVEs that have a resolution. So don't tell me CVEs that don't have a resolution, because there's nothing most likely you can do about it unless you are the vendor, right? Then that makes sense. Otherwise, it doesn't help you. I use Trivi at the CI level. It is a rather brilliant tool. And the beauty of Trivi is you can actually detect CVEs in more than just Docker images. You can use it against infrastructure as code, like Terraform scripts, and all. That's why over here you might have noticed. Well, that's not helpful. You might have noticed that right here you have to use the word image Alpine 310, because I'm telling it I want to interrogate an image as opposed to my Terraform scripts or something else. So it does scale to other tools in your DevOps stack. And I think it's a rather, I have nothing against SNCC. We use it at clients, but this is a thing I found, free, open source. Take a look at it. One thing I get a lot from many clients is that they have high integrity requirements. In other words, when I do this, and let's take a quiz here because I have a little bit of time. So when I do Docker pull Ubuntu 22.10, right? Everyone is aware that if I do a Docker pull today and I do a Docker pull tomorrow for 22.10, I can actually get two different images. Yes? Yes? How many of you are shocked? You should be shocked. You would think a version number means something. No. The version number is essentially a pointer into the Docker Hub registry. Now, the idea here is that you are getting 22.10, the version of Ubuntu, but if they were to install security patches into 22.10, they can republish the image again as 22.10. So if you do a Docker pull, what you do is you get the ones with the security patch. However, you don't know exactly what you are getting if you're doing a Docker pull every day, right? A lot of my clients, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but there is a handful of clients who say, we need to know exactly what we are getting. Once we pin down the version, we don't want it to change underneath us. That might be because you're trying to avoid, and there was an issue a while back on man-in-the-middle attacks, where someone could sit in the middle between you and your registry and then send you something that looks like Ubuntu 2010 but isn't really. In order to fix this, they suggested coming up with something called a digest. A digest is a SHA-256 of the contents of the image. You can see it right now. If you went to your Docker terminal and you did a Docker image ls with the digest flag, you will actually see the digest for all the images that you have pulled from a public or a V2 registry. That hash can be actually used in a from. So the above one is the one that you are most likely familiar with. I'm saying give me 1910. That is not deterministic, but does get patched. The lower one is extremely deterministic, but that also means that I am willing to live with the fact that I may not get the patches that they supply to 1910. Yeah? Now the downside to the second option is it's not human readable. You have no idea unless I call you up and say, hey, that's to Ubuntu 1910, or I put a comment on top of it. Ironically, you can't search for that hash on a V2 registry. So once you put that line in there and if you forget to put the comment, even you don't know what you are using, which is a problem, right? So you sort of trade-offs on both sides. Neil talked about it today in today's architectural or meta architecture. It's a trade-off. You want integrity or you want human readability and some level of automatic update and patch. Good? Questions? I give this tip to everyone and everyone ignores me. Standardize your labels. How many of you apply labels to your images? How many of you have a structured labeling syntax that everyone in your organization uses? How many of you have structured logging? But you gave that up for labels? Why? I highly recommend that if you were to look at the OCI, the Open Container Initiative spec, you will see that they actually tell you all of the labels that will be applied to all of their images. And I highly encourage you to look over that list, talk to your team, talk to the teams in your organization and say, all right, everybody gather together. Let's figure out all the images the labels we should all be applying to all of our images. Feel free to add more. Feel free to add your pet's name or your partner's name. Do whatever you want. But the top set of labels should be fixed. Because if you are aware, the benefits of using a label on an image is the container that's running from that image inherits those labels. In other words, if you have structured labeling on your images, you can build tools on top of that. You can build information radiators. You can build dashboards. You can do all that good stuff for minimal cost. There is really no downside here other than writing those labels in a specific format. But there's more. One thing that a lot of people make a mistake, notice that this label set is a multi-label set. In other words, I'm not creating n number of layers. I'm also using only static strings. That's important because what that allows me to do is push that label set to the top of my Docker file. It's not going to change. It's never going to change. Just build it once and then keep using that layer over and over again. And I normally do this, I usually have arguments for build dates, version control ref, or your git sha, what build URL, blah, blah, blah. I define arguments, and at the bottom of my Docker file, I apply more labels. In other words, every time I build, that layer will change. Yes? Well, hopefully it will change. But I don't take the hit of having to rebuild every layer from the top down. I'm sorry, say that again?
If you don't want to mess up your Docker cache, you put this line as one of the last lines of your build, right?
So the question is not, if you don't want to blow the cache, then you want those lines at the bottom. Correct. Yes. And that's what I'm saying. So what you do is you define a bunch of static labels on the top of your Docker file. You define all your other instructions, and then at the bottom, I mean, these args you can define anywhere. Usually I define args at the top, but I use them at the very bottom. Because even if an arg changes, the layer where the arg is defined is not affected. It's only the layer where the arg is used that is affected. So push those dynamic labels down. Does that make sense to everyone? Everyone doing all right with that? How many of you have run Inception? Docker in Docker. Why would you ever do this? If your CI system is running in Docker and your CI system is building images, it needs to run Docker in the image or the container, ergo you're running Docker in Docker. One trick to avoid this is not to run Docker in Docker, but to run Docker from Docker. So thanks to the question that the gentleman brought up earlier, what I can do is I can start a container like this. Notice that I'm running Ubuntu 21.10, and we saw this little trickery up front. I'm mounting the Docker socket volume in the container. I'm going to run this as a container and then go ahead and I'm going to install Docker in that container, right? So I have a container running from Ubuntu, and on top of it, I'm going to go ahead and install Docker. We'll give it a second. My apologies. I need to show you the installation just so you're convinced it actually works. And then while that's going on, I'm going to split the screen here, and let's just do a Docker container ls. All right, so up 32 seconds ago, we have Crazy Newton, the container. Yes? That's the container that's running up here. On my host, I currently have 3 containers running: Crazy Newton, Beautiful Johnson, and Devnexus. Brilliant. Now, remember that on my host, if I were to do a Docker image ls, I have all of these images already cached, right? So they are on my host in my Docker setup. Come on, Devnexus, you can do better than this. So let's just do a Docker container ls. What I've done while it is running, I might as well give you the trick, is I created, oh man, this is annoying. I created this container in orange at the top. What I did is I mounted the Docker socket from my host into the container, and now inside the container, I'm installing Docker. Everyone so far with me? So with that in mind, man, so much for the whole theatrical, dramatic showdown.
So this is different from running an actual Docker container inside the Docker.
Correct. You sound very disappointed for some reason.
No, actually, this was related to some question of scaling building.
Okay. All right, so I have Docker running inside the container, right? But if I were to do a Docker container ls, notice you see what's on the host. So any command you run in the container is actually being executed on the host. You're not running Docker in Docker, you're running Docker from Docker. So in the container, if you were to build a new image, where does the image get cached? On the host, which means even the container goes away, which most likely, if you're running everything in CI on containers, those containers are ephemeral. But you don't lose the cache. And you can do this for all kind of trickery, right? How many of you are Java developers? How many of you are JavaScript developers? Right, so whenever we do an npm install, what happens? You download the internet, right? You can do trickery like this to build layers and images to do fancy stuff. Was there a question there for me, Shantanu? Are you good?
Yeah, actually, the question was for when you say instead of creating a Docker container inside a Docker container, would that be a problem from the perspective of volumes or vulnerability?
So the question is, if I run a Docker container inside a Docker container, are there concerns with usage of volumes or from a vulnerability perspective? If you're going to run Docker from Docker, you're running Docker in privileged mode, which right off the bat is a problem. That said, it doesn't matter. If you are talking to the host daemon or you're talking to the daemon running inside the container, volumes will still work. The problem is that if you're running Docker in Docker, you can mount a volume on the container running inside the container, but if the host container disappears, you also lose the volumes with it. See what I'm saying? So, all right. This is not the sidecar pattern, which to some extent Neil alluded to in today's keynote, or the sidecar pattern you might be used in containers. I have to show this to you, so let me just escape out of that and move one up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that. So all I've done is I've created an Nginx container running in daemon mode, and I'm grabbing the container ID. Now what I'm going to do is start another container which has the same PID flag set. So all I'm doing here is this container is running, I grab the container ID, I am then applying that container ID as the container PID. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to split this screen. I'm going to do a Docker container ls. Where's my Nginx container? Eager, whatever that is. So I will do a Docker, what should I do here? Docker exec against this ps aux. So these are all the processes running inside the Nginx container. Yes, everyone with me so far? Everyone knows what Nginx is. It's a web server. By default, Nginx runs a master process and 2 worker processes. However, this container that I'm running on the top one, notice this is an Alpine container. This is not an Nginx container, yeah? But if I were to go here and do a ps aux, what do you see? Tough crowd. Okay, what you are seeing is the process tables of the Nginx container, which means what? In this container, we have a PID 9. Let's do a PID 8. So I'm going to kill, PID 8. Yes? What did I just do? You can speak up. What? Notice 8 is gone. So you can remote control one container from another container by just mapping the process tables between the 2 containers. Yeah?
But what is the advantage compared to just doing a Docker exec? I try to understand why you wouldn't do just a Docker exec, to have a shell inside the container and do this kind of thing.
Let me answer that. So the question is, why would I do this? Well, let me give you another example, and then maybe you will understand what the power here is. You can not only share process IDs, you can share networks, you can share volumes, and you can even share memory between containers. So I'll give you a use case that we used. We used a product that would help us do sort of WebRTC. So you connect a video session. What that piece of software did is it created sessions, but it kept the sessions in memory. So I'm running a sort of WebRTC product in a container where the sessions that I've opened are in memory. What's the downside there? If the container dies, all my sessions die. We shared that memory, the session memory, across 5 containers. So even if one container died, the sessions don't die. Does that help? More of you should be a little paranoid about this. I'm a little disconcerted by the level of discontentment I'm seeing in this room. Yes, question? Yes. Let's take it after this. Okay, I have to get into some. No, you're fine. You're fine. It's a great question. I just won't get into some of the Linux details or whatever. So we can talk if you want. Yeah. All right, very quickly. How am I doing on time? Just a quick tip. I tend to use this all the time. Some people don't know that Docker allows you to do Go templating when you're doing things like image ls, container ls. So you can just do a .digest. This is a Go template. Another tool that I use a lot is JQ. Anyone use JQ in this room? JSON query. So I pipe the output of Docker, and then you can just pipe it to JQ and do all your interrogations through that. The nice thing, or the bad thing, is that we have now all settled on JSON as a intermediate medium. And so you have a bunch of tooling on top of that that's available to you. You can fix this up for permanently if you were just to put the PS format property, and that would affect every time you do Docker container ls. If you set an images format, it would affect every time you do image ls, so on and so forth. I don't know why this slide is here. I'm going to skip this. How many of you have a Docker ignore in your project? How many of you know what the Docker ignore is for? Okay. Since I think I saw 8 hands in the room, so let me just talk about this real quick. I have a project here. I have a Docker ignore file. I'm going to pretend, like many of you, that I don't have a Docker ignore file. I'm going to go here. I'm going to exit out of this. I'm going to keep, I can exit out of that. Okay. So if I, let me just make sure I'm in the right directory. Nope, I should be in this directory. So just to show you, there is an empty Docker ignore file in here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Docker build. Just bear in mind that I am running it without build kit. I'll talk about this in a second. But anyway, I just run, and many of you might have noticed that you see this number starting to clock up. Yes? The impression that a lot of people have, I'm going to Control C out of this because we don't need to see it. The impression that a lot of people have is, for example, if I do something like this, or if I were to take a specific file from this particular file system, right? If I did copy entrypoint.shell to entrypoint.shell, a lot of people have the impression that this file is this file. Is that correct? That's a myth. That is not true. What happens is when you run docker build, Docker reads all the files in the current folder. That's why it asks you for this little dot. Give me the context where this build thing is running in. Once you give it the dot, what Docker does is it takes, let me just show you, all of these files and copies them into what is called the build context. In other words, it snapshots the entire file system to memory. Yes? Anytime you say, I want to copy this file into the image, you are not copying it from the file system. You are actually copying it from the build context into the image. So what should you be loading into the build context? Only the files you ever need to copy into the image. Yes? Ergo, I can guarantee you, all of you have a folder in your project today that grows over time no matter how big or small your project gets. Anyone tell me what that folder is? Target may be there. No one? Oh, there you go. And I can bet you that if your project is older than, say, 3 to 5 years, your .git directory is bigger than the rest of your project combined. I guarantee it. Why? Because Git's history is immutable. It only grows in time. It can never reduce in time unless you do some crazy business with filter branching or rebasing. So why are you copying that into the build context? How many of you have ever copied the .git repository into an image? And if you have, I really want to know why. Yeah? So, if you go back, let me just show you. Let's just watch this number. Notice the amount of time Docker is using to try and copy 41 megs across. With a well-designed Docker ignore file, let me just get rid of this change I made so I don't break everything. Put this, notice the first thing I ignore is the .git. Shantanu mentioned the target or the build directory, which Maven users are used to. I skip all my Eclipse files, I skip all my Gradle files, I skip the Docker Compose themselves, I skip all documentation. And now if I were to build, notice we were at 41 megs 165 KB. Your builds are faster, and if you have this tendency in your Docker file to do something like this, right? You are not copying potentially anything sensitive. You're not copying anything that's unnecessary. But having a well-designed Docker file gives you all of those permissions. So the question is, if I'm running this in CI, I may not have the .git directory. It depends. Most of the projects I work in, the branch or whatever is cloned locally into the workspace. So there is a .git directory created. It depends on what CI system you are using. I'm not saying it's always true, but at least in most Jenkins, if you're using, or even Circle CI, when you have the .yaml, where's that .yaml coming from? Somewhere there's a clone or a pull happening where everything is built, you get the .git directory. Now you can get away with it by doing things like shallow clones or sparse checkouts, sure, but again, it's one file. There's no downside to it. Somebody else had a comment here. Yep. The shallow clone, yeah, absolutely. And that's a great technique. The thing that sometimes breaks over there is the trouble with shallow clones is that if you're doing, we do a lot of things like automated changelog generation. There we need the git log because we need to see history where the tags appeared and all that business. And the other downside to that is if you do submodules. Submodules will very hard to deal with shallow clones because then you have to check out the parent module, the sub module at the right commits, all that shenanigans ensue. But you bring up a valid point. I'm not disagreeing with you. So please, the way I usually start off is I use the .gitignore as a baseline, right? And then on top of that, I at least add the .git, and then it depends how you are playing with this, but it's a good starting point. So you reduce your build times, you potentially produce leaner images if you tend to do a .copy. You reduce cache invalidation, because if you're doing a .copy, if you're only copying the stuff that you absolutely need, the chances of that varying as opposed to the whole directory varying are a lot less. And then you avoid accidental secrets, right? You can safely do a ... as long as you've ignored all your private keys and your credentialing and project property files or whatever. Entry point plus command. Does anyone know the difference? One of the most confusing commands. I highly encourage you to think about how you design your images. So one thing you might notice that if I run just a popular Jenkins image, if I just run it, you notice that it starts Jenkins, right? That's the default behavior. But if I were to give it an argument at the end, you notice it behaves nicely and gives me a bash prompt. The benefits of this are innumerable because they're not assuming how I'm going to consume the image. They're giving me the flexibility in how I do that. How do I pull this off? Well, what I'm going to do here is so let's just open up I'll just open up a dockerfile.sample. Let's just paste it on Alpine 3.12. I'll just move this over to the side, put this over here, and down here in the Docker file, I will do an entry point echo, and I'll do a command world, right? So this is the Docker file I'm going to build. Where am I right now? Practical Docker. So let's just go ahead and Docker build. Docker build -t. I'll just call it demo. It doesn't matter. dockerfile.sample in the current directory. Just to make sure I did build the right one, let me be sure. Yeah, okay. So we built a demo image out of that Docker file. If I were to say docker run demo, notice what you get. You get world. What does that tell you? That the default command that ran in the container is echo world. Yeah? It's the first bit of information you need to know. So if I were to say docker run demo devnexus, let's see what happens. Oh, well, that's interesting. So it still did an echo, but what got overridden? So the default command that runs in a container is a combination of entry point plus command in that order. Consequently, if you pass an argument at the end of the docker run command, it blows away the command. Now you might be wondering, I don't have an entry point or I don't have a command in my image. Well, that's coming because you are most likely inheriting from Alpine or Ubuntu or some, they have defined an entry point or command. If no one in the entire lineage, it's just considered an empty string. So it works either ways. So now that we have that understanding, the next thing you need to understand is that if I go to Docker, if I over here open up entry point, nope, entry point, is that there are 3 variations of that command. So I'm going to blow away, I don't know what this is. So I'm going to just use what is called the shell command. The one you just saw me use is the square bracket, double quote, exec syntax. Let's just not use that. I'm going to use the default one, and this is the 080 Docker entry point. So let's just do a docker build -d demo -f 080 in the current directory. Hopefully this builds faster than the other one. I accidentally, I think I did when I did the Docker system prune, I think I hit yes, I blew away the cache. I was just thinking to myself, did I do that or did I do this that morning? So we'll give it a second. All right, well, that wasn't too bad. So I built an image called demo. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split the screen over here, and I'm going to say docker run, we'll give it a name, Raju demo, and my Docker service, the service running inside, is just a Java service. So I'm executing Java jar given the name of a jar file. That's all I'm doing. If you're not a Java developer, it's node main.js. If you're a C# developer, it's, but I know nothing about C#, so let's move on. All it does is this is shadow over 5, 6, 7, whatever. If you recall, the name of the container I gave was Raju. So what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to do a docker exec against the Raju container, and I'm going to do a psaux. What you see is that the Java process running is PID 8. PID 1 happens to be shell. If you're familiar with how Linux processes work, if I were to say, time this, docker stop the container Raju, this will take just over 10 seconds. How do I know that? I know that because if you understand how Unix processes work, the docker stop command sends a stop to PID 1 in the container. However, the PID 1 in the container recognizes I have a child process running underneath me, so it tries to stop that. That's usually not successful for a variety of reasons. So Docker, after 10 seconds, sends a Docker kill, which all of you might be familiar with, is not the most elegant way to stop a process. So what we can do is, instead of using this, let's try the other one. I'll build the same image again. Let me just clean up the Raju container. I built it. Let's run it again. Same behavior, nothing has changed. However, if I were to do the exec, notice that PID1 is now Java jar. Which means if I were to do a Docker stop, time it, we don't even have to time it because that is a well-behaved container. How's everyone doing with that? Any questions? I'm not done yet. So one more piece. So 2 pieces. Entry point plus command is the default command that runs in any container. Second, the exec format guarantees that PID1 should be the PID1 in the container. The takeaway from this part of the conversation is that you want PID1 to be the process that you want running. Not shell, not a wrapper, the process you want running. Java, Node, what have you. So how do we get the best of both worlds? Here's the thing I don't like about this syntax. You know what this is? It's shell in a JSON array. That's what it is. So what I recommend, by the way, when I recommend means it is blatantly stolen from the open source ecosystem. Don't give me credit for any of this, right? I'm just the messenger. What I normally recommend is to do these 3 lines of code. I will build it while I'm talking about it, so we are not waiting. So what I do is I first copy an entryPoint.shell somewhere on the path. Then the entry point is entryPoint.shell, and the command can be any string. It doesn't have to be default. You can call it whatever you want, put your pet's name, put your partner's name, put your name. No one cares. What have I done here? Well, let's talk about what entryPoint.shell is. So I'm going to open up entryPoint.shell. I'm going to split the screen to the right-hand side. If you remember the behavior, the default command running in this container is what? EntryPoint plus command. Yes? So if I were to simply run docker run demo, we should get the exact behavior we saw earlier. And how did I pull that off? If I just run docker run demo, basically what I'm running is entry point with an argument of default. Yes? The default is the first conditional over here. If the first argument given to me is default, then this is a very important keyword, exec, which puts this as PID1, and I run Java jar. Make sense to everyone? But then, what's the beauty of this? I could Control-C out of this and run docker run demo bash, just like we saw with the Jenkins image. Oh, my apologies. I should run it interactive teletype, but you see this running user supplied arg, right? Notice I got a bash prompt because what I did is by passing bash as the final argument, I overrode default. Ergo, bash was supplied as the 0th argument, or first argument. If fails, I go into the else, I echo running user supplied arg, and then I exec whatever you give me. So you can do a docker exec psaux, you can do a docker exec blah, whatever you want, and the container accepts it. This is a well-containing behavior. What the exec buys you is PID1 is the process you just supplied. The other benefits is instead of whatever these shenanigans are, you get your editor understands .shell. You can do conditionals, you can do while loops, you can do functions, you can organize that code any way you want because it is code. How's everyone doing with that conversation?
Why is the $1 instead of $0?
Bash.
Oh, bash.
$0 is the name of the script itself. So entryPoint.shell will be $0. If that doesn't make sense, it's because it's not meant to make sense. But that's how bash works. Any other questions? So again, if anybody wants to walk up and get the slides, feel free to. I've put everything in the slide deck. I think Devnexus will collect the slides and hand them to you on a zip file or something, some business. So anyway, use the exec format. Put shell where shell belongs, which is a shell script. Make sure the root process is correct. And this is extremely flexible because I do not assume how you're going to consume my image. I give you the flexibility in consuming it. And I'm out of time. So thanks for coming in. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.